Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. An ethical life does not begin when we feel prepared. It begins when something presses before language arrives, a pause that lingers too long, a decision deferred while its effects continue elsewhere. We prefer to imagine responsibility as a choice we make once our reasons are settled and our position feels stable. In practice, it appears already underway. It asks for response before certainty, before reassurance, and before we understand who we might become by answering it. This episode stays with that moment where obligation precedes clarity and action is demanded before explanation can catch up. Clarity does not arrive before action. It forms while something is already unfolding. A message sits unanswered and the chest tightens. A meeting is postponed and a silence settles that weighs more than refusal. We prefer to believe responsibility waits for understanding, that it can be delayed until reasons feel stable and motives feel clean. But obligation does not operate by consent. It presses while the mind is still negotiating, and the field shifts even as we hesitate. Delay is rarely empty. It presents as restraint or prudence, yet it is already in action with consequences. Time does not pause while positions are refined. Others adapt, systems continue, pressure relocates. What we call waiting often functions as a quiet transfer of burden to places we do not have to see. Delay redistributes cost. This is why hesitation can feel safe while it alters outcomes elsewhere. Much of this delay is sustained by reassurance seeking. We tell ourselves we are waiting for clarity when we are often waiting for a form of action that will not expose us. We want movement without residue, decision without implication, responsibility without loss. When these conditions do not exist, hesitation hardens into explanation. The mind becomes busy, producing distinctions and counter-arguments that resemble care. This busyness does not slow the world. It dulls our contact with how the world continues to move. There is grief. It is not grief for a wrong choice, but for the loss of exemption. Once responsibility becomes visible, the fantasy of acting without cost collapses. The body registers this before any story arrives. Breathing shortens. Fatigue appears before effort begins. Anxiety surfaces without a clear object. These sensations are not mistakes. They signal that action will alter us whether we agree to it or not. Action under these conditions rarely feels confident. It feels narrow and exposed. There are situations where no response preserves moral cleanliness, where every option leaves a trace. The error is to treat that trace as a warning to retreat. Residue is not failure. It is the mark of participation in a world that does not organize itself around our need for coherence. Waiting does not remove it. It concentrates it. Responsibility does not require readiness. It requires presence. Presence here is not calm or certainty. It is remaining in contact with what is already being asked instead of withdrawing into endless internal argument. When presence is avoided, comfort quietly becomes the ethical reference point. When presence is maintained, action proceeds without guarantee. Delay is not neutrality. It is already shaping who carries the weight. There is no position outside the field from which action carries no effect. Even refusal alters outcomes. Clarity is not the reward for acting well. It is the discipline action teaches, slowly and imperfectly, once the hope of exemption has been relinquished. Conflict rarely announces itself as conflict. It arrives as noise. Attention scatters. The body remains keyed long after the moment has passed. A jaw tightens while the mind searches for reasons. The feeling is not that one thing is wrong, but that everything is slightly off at once. This is often taken for a lack of information. More data feels like the solution, but the disturbance usually comes first. The inner field is already divided before the argument begins. Desire is often the first force to pull attention off center. Not desire as longing alone, but desire as gravity. It bends perception toward whatever promises relief, affirmation, or control. As attention circles what it wants, the world narrows. Alternatives fade, consequences blur. Urgency replaces orientation. Action taken from this state tends to overshoot or recoil, not because the situation is unclear, but because perception has already been organized around outcome rather than requirement. Anger often follows, not as a separate emotion, but as desire obstructed. When what is wanted does not yield, frustration hardens into judgment, and judgment into certainty. The mind becomes most decisive at the moment it is least accurate. Decisions made here feel clean and forceful. They simplify the field. Yet they frequently amplify harm because they answer resistance rather than in the actual demands of the situation. Fear is rarely absent. It may not appear as panic, but as a background vigilance scanning for threat, loss, or comparison. Fear protects the identity that desire has begun to assemble. Under its influence, attention fragments further. Reaction replaces response. We begin answering situations that are no longer present, guided by rehearsal and anticipation rather than contact. Responsibility does not disappear here. It is deferred, and deferral reshapes outcomes whether acknowledged or not. Comparison intensifies this fragmentation. The self measures itself against others, against imagined standards, against earlier versions of itself. This measurement claims to offer orientation, but usually deepens instability. Attention turns outward, while obligation remains unmet. The self becomes a project to be managed rather than a participant in a situation that requires response. Action stalls while identity is curated. Overthinking is resistance expressed cognitively. The mind generates options, objections, and refinements not to clarify action, but to delay exposure to consequence. This delay feels responsible because it is busy, but busyness does not halt impact. While the mind circulates, the body stays tense, the environment continues to move, and others adapt. Costs accumulate quietly. None of these forces are simply wrong. Desire points toward relief, fear points toward safety, anger points toward leverage, comparison points toward orientation. Each carries partial legitimacy. Distortion arises when any one of them governs alone. Discernment is the capacity to feel these pulls without being commandeered by them. It is sensed as a widening rather than a conclusion. Urgency drops slightly, breathing eases, proportion returns, the forces remain present, but they no longer decide. Here, discernment restores maneuverability. Responsibility can move again without being seized by the loudest demand. Discipline is often mistaken for withdrawal, a tightening meant to insulate the self from disturbance. But discipline begins when attention stays, a pause before reacting, a breath that returns the body to the room. What fragments action is not exposure to the world, it is exposure without steadiness. When pressure arrives and attention cannot remain, reaction fills the gap. This is why discipline rarely feels admirable. It does not announce itself as change. It appears as repetition, returning to the same orientation when nothing feels resolved. Continuing without dramatic reassurance. Discipline does not remove fatigue. It often exists alongside it. What it quietly asks is the surrender of the hope that effort will feel meaningful in the moment. The disciplined act is not elevated or pure, it is simply maintained. Discipline is not the suppression of impulse. It is the refinement of perception that makes impulse less governing. When attention is scattered, even minor pressures provoke reaction. When attention is gathered, the same pressures can be felt without dictating response. Desire, fear, and urgency remain present. They lose the authority to decide. Discipline widens the field in which these forces can be held without being obeyed. This is where discipline differs from control. Control seeks dominance over experience. Discipline seeks usability. Control narrows the field to enforce outcome. Discipline stabilizes the field so contact can be sustained. When discipline fails, it usually fails in two directions. It hardens into restraint pursued for relief, which becomes avoidance, or it collapses into routine without awareness, repetition without contact. In both cases, attention narrows. Extremes of indulgence and rigidity share this failure. One overwhelms contact, the other starves it. Much of discipline operates below intention. Habits of sleep, pace, speech, posture, and consumption quietly shape what can be perceived and sustained. These are not optimizations or moral badges, they are conditions of ethical clarity. When the body is disregarded, attention fractures more easily. When rhythms lose coherence, discernment becomes fragile. Discipline restores coherence not through mastery, but through care that keeps perception intact under strain. Discipline can also be misused. It can be imposed to normalize harm or to extract endurance where refusal would be ethical. Discipline is not obedience. It serves responsibility only when it preserves contact rather than enforcing compliance. There are moments when the ethical act is not greater steadiness, but refusal of a discipline that protects power rather than attention. Discipline is the practice of staying usable under pressure. Discipline does not guarantee right action. It makes right action possible more often. It does not resolve inner conflict. It prevents conflict from seizing control, and it does not remove responsibility. It removes the need to stage responsibility as crisis each time it appears. In this way, discipline is not preparation for ethical life. It is the form ethical life takes when pressure persists and attention must remain intact. Responsibility does not appear in abstraction. It appears inside roles, relationships, and situations already in motion, often before they feel chosen and long before they feel understood. We like to imagine duty as something voluntary and principled, something we take on after reflection. In practice, obligation is encountered as constraint. It arrives shaped by history, position, and circumstance, asking not what we would prefer to do, but what now falls to us because we are here and not elsewhere. This is why responsibility is rarely clean. It is not evenly distributed, and it is not interchangeable. What is required of one person in a situation may be inappropriate or even harmful if performed by another. Attempts to bypass this specificity in the name of purity often become evasions. Borrowed ethics can function as disguise. Acting according to someone else's sense of purpose may feel elevated, but it often allows us to avoid the friction of our own position. An imperfect response grounded in where one actually stands usually causes less harm than an elegant response imported from elsewhere. There are situations in which every available action carries cost. Harm cannot be eliminated, only redistributed. Loss cannot be avoided, only borne. In these contexts, inaction is not neutral. It reallocates burden through delay, omission, or deferral, often toward those with less capacity to absorb it. This redistribution is rarely dramatic. It happens quietly, while responsibility appears unresolved. The fantasy of moral cleanliness collapses here. What remains is not the question of how to stay innocent, but how to stay present without denial. Much hesitation at this level is not confusion about right and wrong. It is resistance to implication. To act is to accept that action will alter us, that some consequences will not be reversible or redeemable. This is difficult not because it is unclear, but because it ends the hope that responsibility can be exercised without cost to the self. Regret does not always signal error. Sometimes it signals contact with irreversibility and the loss of imagined exemption. Discernment still matters under these conditions, but it rarely arrives as certainty. It operates under pressure, with incomplete information, and with the knowledge that any choice will foreclose others. Not all responses are equivalent, even when all are compromised. But distinguishing between them often strains attention rather than clarifying it. Responsibility persists when motives are mixed, outcomes uncertain, and explanations inadequate. Refusing to act does not preserve neutrality. It allows other forces, often less examined and less accountable, to decide. At the same time, not every demand is legitimate. Some roles are structured to distribute harm downward. Some obligations exist to normalize exploitation rather than meet genuine need. Responsibility is not the same as compliance. Being answerable does not mean absorbing whatever pressure is applied. Ethical seriousness includes the capacity to refuse roles that convert endurance into extraction and duty into capture. To remain responsible here requires relinquishing the search for purity without surrendering discernment. Action is not taken to secure moral resolution, but to prevent evasion from becoming the dominant force. Integrity is not the absence of contradiction. It is the willingness to carry contradiction without disguise, including the cost to one's sense of coherence. Duty does not promise clarity. It demands presence. And presence in these moments is the refusal to step away from what is ours to answer, while still refusing what should never have been demanded in the first place. Once implication is accepted, responsibility changes shape. It no longer announces itself primarily as pressure or demand, but as placement. The fatigue comes first, a heaviness in the shoulders before the work even begins, the quiet knowledge that this task will return tomorrow and the day after, without ceremony. What remains is not resolve, but but the settling of attention and effort where they are required, because resistance has exhausted itself and withdrawal would simply move the cost elsewhere. At this point, the moral drama that often surrounds obligation begins to fall away. The self can no longer sustain protest, justification, or constant self-interpretation. Responsibility persists, but the question of what it proves about me loses urgency. Action becomes quieter, less narrated, less defended. The work remains difficult, but it is no longer carried as evidence of virtue or failure. It is carried because it must be, and because not carrying it would not restore balance. This shift does not make responsibility lighter, it makes it steadier. Cost is no longer something to be negotiated away or overcome. It is absorbed into the rhythm of participation. Fatigue still appears, but it is no longer treated as a warning that something has gone wrong. It is recognized as part of staying involved when conditions do not resolve. Endurance here is not heroic. It is procedural. It looks like returning to the task again, without the expectation that doing so will complete anything. Service in this register is easily misunderstood. It is not self-sacrifice as spectacle, nor altruism as identity. It does not require erasing the self or sanctifying suffering. It requires allowing the self to stop being the measure of the work. Effort is placed where it belongs, even when that placement offers no affirmation. Recognition may not come, outcomes may remain ambiguous. The action continues anyway, because disengagement would not restore balance, it would simply relocate burden. What is relinquished here is not agency, but the hope that agency will redeem the situation. Responsibility no longer aims at moral cleanliness or inner resolution. It aims at continuation, keeping something from breaking further, holding a line long enough for others to respond, maintaining a process that would otherwise collapse under neglect. Much of this labour is invisible. Its effects are noticed only when they stop. This posture carries risk. Quiet continuation can slide into resentment. Endurance can be mistaken for infinite capacity. What begins as responsibility can be normalised into expectation, especially in structures that reward invisibility and extract steadiness without acknowledgement. Limits are not indulgence here. They are part of accuracy. Knowing when to continue and when to refuse is itself a form of responsibility, particularly when continuation serves power rather than care. Here, responsibility means continuing without expecting redemption, while remaining alert to when continuation becomes harm. Responsibility at this stage often feels lonely. Not because others are absent, but because the work does not generate shared meaning in the moment. It does not easily translate into stories of growth or purpose. Its value lies in what is sustained rather than what is achieved, the absence of escalation, the preservation of capacity, the quiet spreading of effort across time instead of its concentration as crisis. Responsibility here does not feel like carrying weight toward an end. It feels like standing in place and holding. The self remains involved and altered by what it does, but the need to interpret those changes as success or failure diminishes. What matters is that the work continues without fantasy, without protest, and without the assumption that doing it well will make things whole. Care becomes distorted when it moves faster than perception. A voice softens before the situation has registered. An explanation rushes in to fill a silence that needed to be held. The body leans forward to reduce discomfort, even as something unresolved tightens in the room. Much harm is done not by indifference, but by care that has lost accuracy. When attention accelerates toward alleviation or affirmation, it begins responding to unease rather than to need. Ethical clarity depends on seeing without immediately intervening. This does not mean withholding response. It means allowing the situation to arrive fully before action is shaped. Premature care often answers the discomfort of the witness rather than the requirements of what is witnessed. It soothes, explains, or repairs before the contours of harm are clear. In doing so, it can reinforce dependency, obscure accountability, or quiet tensions that need to remain audible. Care that cannot tolerate friction tends to reproduce the instability it seeks to resolve. Boundaries are not the opposite of compassion. They are one of its conditions. A boundary marks where responsibility can be sustained without dilution. Without boundaries, care becomes indiscriminate, and indiscriminate care quickly becomes exhausted or resentful. When everything is treated as equally urgent, nothing is held accurately. Ethical attention requires differentiation. It asks not only who is suffering, but how that suffering is produced, maintained, or transferred through response. The same impulse to help can either stabilize a situation or deepen its distortion, depending on whether attention remains disciplined. Silence can be an ethical act in this register. Not all speech clarifies, not all intervention repairs. There are moments when speaking functions as self-protection, a way of demonstrating care without bearing cost. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can preserve space for accountability, allow consequences to surface, or prevent confusion from spreading. This silence is not withdrawal, it is restraint in service of clarity. It holds attention steady rather than dispersing it through reaction. Care can also become complicit. When comfort is treated as the primary aim, care shifts from addressing causes to managing effects. Relief offered at the wrong scale can absorb pressure that should travel outward or upward. Soothing individuals can deflect attention from structures that generate their suffering. In these cases, compassion stabilizes harmful arrangements by making them easier to endure. Comfort is not the measure of ethical care. Accuracy requires asking whether care reduces harm or merely contains it. The same distinction applies to non-violence, which is often taken as passivity. To reduce harm is not to refuse consequence. It is to act with proportion, to avoid unnecessary escalation, and to remain attentive to how response amplifies or dampens instability. Harm cannot always be prevented, but it can often be. Ethical action here is measured not by high purity of intent, but by restraint in execution and accuracy of effect. Care also operates through ordinary conditions that shape perception. Careless speech, habits that exhaust attention, environments that overwhelm the senses, all erode ethical clarity. These are not private preferences. They determine what can be noticed and what can be carried in shared space. When attention is depleted, compassion becomes blunt. When the body is disregarded, patience thins. Ethical failure often begins here, long before visible decisions are made. Here, care means acting with proportion rather than speed, and restraint rather than reassurance. Care that sees clearly can remain present without consuming itself. It acts when action reduces harm, withholds when intervention would distort, and accepts some tensions must be carried rather than resolved. Time is not a neutral background against which responsibility unfolds. It presses, it narrows, it decides. A deadline passes while discussion continues. A window closes without ceremony. A choice that felt reversible yesterday is no longer available today. Finitude does not merely limit what can be done, it reshapes what responsibility is. When time feels open, ethics can afford rehearsal and delay. When time contracts, responsibility sharpens. As pressure increases, the scale of action shifts. What once felt like a personal dilemma reveals itself as a point within a larger movement. Effects propagate through systems, relationships, and futures that will not pause to receive explanation. Ethical reasoning, calibrated only to inner alignment, begins to fail. Consequences distribute unevenly. What appears minor from one position may be decisive from another. Responsibility expands beyond what can be fully felt or held. This expansion is often registered as dread, not because something has gone wrong, but because the limits of agency have become visible. The expectation that effort will be matched by outcome dissolves. The belief that care will be reciprocated weakens. Insight at this level does not comfort. It compresses attention toward what cannot be avoided. It clarifies what must be addressed now, not what could be perfected later. Clarity under time pressure does not arrive as confidence or mastery. It appears as recognition that only certain responses remain viable. Time removes alternatives quietly, leaving not freedom in the abstract, but direction under constraint. This narrowing is not paralysis. It is the condition under which action becomes possible without fantasy. Acceptance of constraint does not cancel agency, it concentrates it. The body often registers this shift before the mind does. Breathing shortens, movement becomes economical, speech tightens, attention drops from speculation into sequence. What can be done now? What must be done next? These are not signs of panic. They are adaptations to finitude. They keep response tethered to what time still allows rather than to what explanation would prefer. Under pressure, the temptation is control. To simplify the field, to impose clean narratives, to treat complexity as error rather than condition. But control exercised at the wrong scale magnifies harm. Urgency without proportion escalates. Clarity without humility coerces. Ethical seriousness requires accepting that not everything can be held, fixed, or resolved within the time available. Acting as if it can often worsens what one hopes to prevent. Time also renders action irreversible. Once taken, a response cannot be undone without cost. This irreversibility is not a flaw in ethical life. It is its ground. Responsibility has weight because it closes paths. The fantasy of keeping all options open is a refusal of finitude disguised as prudence. Serious action always forecloses something, including versions of the self that might have emerged under different conditions. Proportion preserves future capacity. Here, responsibility means acting at the scale where influence is real and stopping short of gestures that consume what must be preserved. Under time pressure, the measure of ethical action is not whether it achieves resolution, but whether it intervenes without exhausting what comes next. Sometimes this requires restraint. At other times, it requires commitment. In both cases, the test is whether response dampens instability rather than amplifying it, and whether it leaves room for further response rather than using it up. When external guarantees fall away, responsibility turns inward without becoming self-centered. This turn is rarely dramatic. It is felt as the quiet strain of continuing when encouragement thins, a morning where the work resumes without renewed conviction, a body that moves through familiar motions while the story that once sustained them no longer persuades. What is required here is not belief or resilience as virtue, but an interior orientation that allows response to continue when reassurance disappears. Responsibility to the self at this level is not about protecting identity. It is about maintaining the conditions under which action remains possible. Motivation ebbs, explanation loosens its hold. What once felt meaningful now feels procedural. This is not failure. It is the point at which responsibility is no longer carried for self-confirmation. What matters is not how the action feels, but whether the interior field remains usable. This interior responsibility is often mistaken for confidence. It is not confidence in outcomes, meaning, or eventual repair. It is posture, the way attention leans when nothing promises resolution. Without this posture, effort collapses into control or exhaustion. With it, action can persist, even as certainty erodes. Trust here is not optimism. It is the refusal to withdraw simply because clarity has not arrived or comfort has been lost. Doubt, fatigue, and incomplete understanding are ordinary companions in this terrain. They do not signal error. They signal that responsibility is no longer being performed for reassurance. What distinguishes this posture is persistence without narrative reward. Action continues without the promise that later understanding will justify it. Devotion takes shape here not as intensity or conviction, but as steadiness. Effort is placed where it belongs, even when the reasons for doing so no longer feel compelling in the moment. This requires a shift in how the self is held. The self remains present, but it no longer occupies the center of interpretation. Attention moves away from what this action says about me and toward whether it sustains what must be sustained. Identity loosens its grip without dissolving. The constant internal accounting of adequacy, virtue, or recognition softens. Responsibility becomes less dramatic and more durable. Receptivity is essential under these conditions. Not passivity, but openness to being corrected by what unfolds, often through others. Persistence without receptivity hardens into rigidity. Interior responsibility includes the willingness to be interrupted, to revise, to receive information that unsettles earlier assumptions. This is demanding. It requires relinquishing the fantasy that commitment guarantees control. Trust grows not through certainty, but through repeated contact with the fact that action can continue even when certainty dissolves. Failure is encountered differently here. When responsibility is oriented toward continuation rather than self-validation, failure does not collapse into shame. It is assessed for information rather than verdict. Adjustments are made. Responsibility resumes. This does not protect from error, but it prevents error from becoming terminal. The interior field remains usable even when missteps occur and consequences must be carried. Here, responsibility to the self means maintaining availability rather than certainty. Responsibility at this level is not about coherence of identity. It is about the capacity to stay present, to act again, and to remain responsive without demanding that action restore wholeness or explain itself. In this way, interior responsibility becomes the quiet condition that allows engagement to persist when nothing external offers reassurance, and when the work continues without promise of completion. Responsibility does not end with the self. It extends outward into worlds that continue after us, into institutions, environments, and cultures that do not pause to register intention. At this scale, responsibility is no longer felt primarily as choice or posture. It is felt as participation in structures that keep moving, whether they are tended to or not. What matters is not whether the world becomes whole, but whether responsiveness is preserved where it is still possible. Here, coherence takes on a collective meaning. It is not shared belief or moral alignment. It is the capacity of systems and relationships to keep responding rather than collapsing under strain. Responsibility to the world looks less like solving problems and more like preventing breakdowns from cascading unchecked. Ethical action shifts from intervention to stewardship, from correction to maintenance, from dramatic response to sustained care. Much of this work is unremarkable. It is repetitive, procedural, and largely invisible. It appears as meetings that do not escalate, processes that remain open, obligations that circulate rather than bottleneck. The ethical question is no longer what can be completed, but what can be sustained. Attention moves away from singular acts and toward patterns of response that accumulate quietly over time. Small failures here compound. So do small continuities. This form of responsibility requires relinquishing the fantasy that ethical action culminates in visible success. Much of what is done responsibly at this scale will not be seen, rewarded, or remembered. Its value lies in what does not happen: crises that do not spiral, systems that do not fracture, harms that are limited rather than eliminated. This absence is difficult to register emotionally, but it is where much ethical labor actually resides. There is no clean separation between individual action and collective effect. Personal responses feed into shared conditions, often indirectly and long after the moment of action has passed. Responsibility here means acting with awareness of how participation amplifies or dampens instability. It requires attention to scale, intervening where influence is real rather than symbolic, resisting gestures that perform care without sustaining it. Accepting that restraint can be more consequential than assertion. The future enters ethical life here not as projection or control, but as inheritance. Actions shape conditions others will have to live inside. Responsibility to the future is not prediction. It is seriousness in the present, leaving space, preserving capacity, avoiding irreversible damage when repair is unlikely. This does not require certainty about what should come next. It requires care about what should not be foreclosed. Continuity itself is not neutral or guaranteed. It is contested, unevenly borne, and often maintained by those least recognized for doing so. Stewardship can be captured. Maintenance can be exploited. Responsibility at this scale therefore includes vigilance about who carries cost and who benefits from stability. Preserving responsiveness must not become a way of normalizing harm or disguising extraction as care. Here, responsibility means sustaining participation without mistaking continuity for justice. There is no final resolution available. The world remains unfinished. Responsibility renews itself without closure. What can be achieved is continuity under pressure. A form of care that does not exhaust itself trying to make things whole, but keeps the horizon usable for those who come next. Ethical life does not culminate in harmony or completion. It persists as coherence of participation, fragile, contested, and necessary beyond the span of any single self. Until next time.